Good day and gratitude, family. This is Face with Bolden Unchained, and we are back tonight. I apologize, I was a few minutes late. I tried to be organized, be prepared, but long as I'm here, I'm here. Are you here? But yes, so congratulations, everyone. We did finish Red Summer. We finished Red Summer. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I did want to read a last excerpt from Richard Wright. And again, that was Red Summer, the summer of 1919, and the awakening of Black America. And then I did say last night we will read the acknowledgments. We want to give credit to Cameron McWhirter, for his work in writing this book. And there are other books about Red Summer and other race riots that have happened against our ancestors. And it's very important that we know where and when these massacres occurred. I mean, I'm not saying none of us on our platforms are saying to cause havoc because of history. What we're saying is we have to know to begin to make things right. I mean, I get the whole we're afraid, we don't want to make you uncomfortable. Maybe I'm phrasing it wrong for us, but, we're very traumatized. We're very traumatized. And at this point, it really don't matter who's uncomfortable. Because if they're not about us healing, we've been uncomfortable. And at this point, if they're not about us healing, then they ain't for us anyway. So, do with it what you may and stuff. But, everyone should be damned ashamed of letting the agendas against Black Americans happen. And then they perpetrate it and cover it up. Everyone should be motherfucking shamed. Everyone. There shouldn't be no motherfucker out there sleeping in peace, knowing that they done perpetrated this whole theft of melanin. They ain't said a word or a whisper to nobody that they claim to love for all the love. So that's where I'm at with it. I don't know where each of us are in our journey on this plane, but we got to find out. We got to find out. So I want to read this right here by Richard R. Wright. And, he was a minister and an editor of the Black newspaper in Philadelphia. Do not be afraid or lose heart because of these riots. They are merely symptoms of the protest of your entrance into a higher sphere of American citizenship. They are the dark hours before morning, which have always come just before the burst of a new civil light. Some people see this light and they provoke these riots, endeavoring to stop it from coming. But God is working. Things will be better for the Negro. We want full citizenship ballot, equal school facilities, and everything else. We fought for them. We will have them. We must not yield. And that's Richard R. Wright. Okay, let's go through the acknowledgments really quick. We're going to give our, our gratitude to Cameron McWhirter for doing the work of this magnificent book. This is a good book. This is a very good book. They all are. We're going to read some more tonight. We're going to start another chapter of another book. Okay, acknowledgments. I'll try to, read this really fast, but I want us to give credit to it. Many authors mention a spouse or partner at the end of their acknowledgments. This practice has always struck me as burying the lady, L-E-D-E. So I will start with my wife. Thanks foremost to Ramsey for putting up with so many nights of me at the keyboard and so many days of me in libraries, and for repeatedly reading drafts of this book. Thanks to my children, Blythe and Finn, for being understanding about their dad working so many weekends. Thanks to my parents. Thanks to the Ruffin family, especially to the late Judge Jack Ruffin and his wife, Judith. 90 years ago, Robert Kerlin, Kerlin, a white advocate for Black rights, wrote in a preface to his book, The Voice of the Negro, 1919, When I told the publisher that I was making this compilation, he remarked that my book would make disagreeable reading. There are worse things than disagreeable reading. Two people, my agent, Jerry Thoma, Thoma, and my editor, Jack McRae, Macrae, committed to this disagreeable book when it was just an idea. Thanks to Jerry, who took a chance on my proposal after we drank tea together in North Haven. Thanks to Jack, Henry Holt's distinguished editor, who shaped what you have just read. Thanks also to Kirsten Reach, his organized assistant editor, and Rita Quintas, Quintas, Henry Holt's senior production editor. Many people aided me in writing this book. Chief among them is Atlanta Journal-Constitution colleague Bill Rankin, a man of infinite patience, who read draft after draft of my manuscript and offered vital criticism. Former pugilist, Pugilist, and Southsider Bill Torpy, Torpy, aided with short editing. Others who critiqued all or portions of this book and offered valuable advice include Dexter Filkins, Hank Kilbanoff, Klibanoff, and that's Filkins, Andrew McWhirter, James Scott, May Gentry, Gentry, Darcy McConnell, Tom Anderson, Goldie Taylor, and Tia Cudahy, Cudayhy. William Tuttle, Professor Emeritus, Emeritus, at the University of Kansas, and the nation's leading scholar on the racial violence in 1919, generously gave me time and encouragement. He also provided his extensive files. Thanks to you all. Thanks to the Neiman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University for granting me a fellowship. It gave me access to incredible resources and allowed me to meet and interact with amazing, intelligent people, including the class of 2007 fellows. Thanks to Harvard University professor Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Higginbotham, and Henry Louis Gates Jr. for allowing a Neiman Fellow to intrude on their graduate seminars and receive their insights on African American history and literature. Thanks to authors Justin Kaplan and Ann Bernays, Bernays, for early encouragement. Thanks to librarians throughout the country for their hard work in helping befuddled people like me find the arcane items for which we are searching. Thanks finally to fellow journalists across this planet who work tirelessly to keep people informed. Awesome. Now, the next time we read this, it'll be much better because you're going to have a book and I'm going to have my book and we're going to read. I juiced some pumpkins. Okay. Let's start our video and then we're going to start our new book. But I wanted to give our credit to that there. Okay, let's see here.
After being accused of sexual assault. Tom Brown, about the lynching that was engraved on a silver spoon? On February 6, 1902, 19-year-old Tom Brown was lynched after being accused of sexual assault. Tom Brown, a Black American from Nicholasville, Kentucky, was accused of assaulting a woman named Della Powell, also of Nicholasville. The alleged assault took place on February 5, 1902, and before police officers were able to take him to jail, a mob captured him and hanged him in front of the Jessamine County Courthouse. The deep racial hostility that permeated Southern society during this time period often served to focus suspicion on Black communities after a crime was discovered or alleged, whether evidence supported that suspicion or not. Almost 25% of all lynchings involved allegations of inappropriate behavior between a Black man and a white woman, which would be characterized as assault or sexual assault. The mere accusation of sexual impropriety regularly aroused violent mobs and ended in lynching. Allegations against Black people were rarely subject to scrutiny. During this era of racial terror, it was quite common for lynching mobs to include prominent community members and for the local press and police to help conceal lynchers' identities to ensure no one was punished or held accountable. On the night of the lynching, a mob of 200 white men assembled at the jail and seized Mr. Brown from police. They then hung him from a tree in front of the county courthouse. Though news reports identified the young woman's brother as a leader of the mob, no one was ever prosecuted for Mr. Brown's murder, and authorities concluded that he met death by strangulation at the hands of parties unknown. In the first 15 years after the Civil War ended, 140 lynchings took place in Kentucky. The lynching practice peaked at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century when Tom Brown was hanged for his alleged assault on a white woman. The quest for justice on Earth continues in 2024.
All right. I think I'll leave that on there. Okay, tonight we will be reading Racial Violence in Kentucky, 1865 to 1940. Lynchings, Mob Rule, and Legal Lynchings by George C. Wright. And that's spelled the same as Richard Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T. And I just got this today. I went and got this today. I picked up a couple of books today, and we'll save, we'll still have hours, but we're gonna, try to get a better understanding of the hurt and disconnect, if that makes sense. To my mother, Amanda Wright Knox, the memory of my father, Scott J. Wright, 1926 to 1972, and my parents-in-law, Ida L. and William H. Ellison. Is it away? I think it is. I don't know if I probably need to leave it like this so I don't cut it off. Acknowledgements. I said I was going to read the front, the cover, and back for you. Racial Violence in Kentucky, 1865 to 1940. Just going to go over the back view here. Lynchings, Mob Rule, and Legal Lynchings by George C. Wright. Racial Violence in Kentucky is the story of the men, women, and children who suffered the scourge, SCOURGE, of racial oppression in the bluegrass state from the end of the Civil War to 1940. In this investigative look into Kentucky's race relations, George C. Wright brings to light a consistent pattern of legally sanctioned and extra-legal violence employed to ensure that Blacks knew their place after the war. In the first study of its kind to target a specific state, Wright demonstrates that despite Kentucky's proximity to the North, its Black population was subjected to racial oppression every bit as severe and prolonged as that found farther south. His examination of the causes and extent of racial violence and of the steps taken by blacks and concerned whites to end the brutality has implications for race relations throughout the United States. Okay, now we'll do we're just going to start with the first chapter, I believe. But let's get the acknowledgments out the way. One of the most enjoyable aspects of writing a book is to thank all of the people who have contributed in some way. My research began during the 1983-1984 school year at Harvard University, where I held an Andrew W. Mellon Faculty Fellowship. The late Nathan I. Huggins, W.E.B. Du Bois Professor of History, and at that time Director of Afro-American Studies, made office space and supplies available to me. My research, especially the time-consuming but very necessary chore of tabulating the number of lynchings and legal executions, was greatly assisted by the following research assistants: Andrew Drozd, D-R-O-Z-D, Laura Mayhall, M-A-Y-H-A-L-L, Dana Lynn Reeser, R-E-C-E-R, and Victoria Seligman, S-E-L-I-G-M-A-N. I'm not sure if that Seligman and that one is the same. It's spelled different and different times and stuff, but yeah. A number of librarians, especially those at Harvard University, the Manuscript Division of the Library of Congress, the Division of Special Collections and Archives at the University of Kentucky, the Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives, and the Office of Interlibrary Loans at the University of Texas, made my task easier. Special mention must be made of James M. Pritchard, archivist at the Kentucky Department for Libraries, who brought to my attention a number of important documents. Additionally, Pritchard graciously researched several different files for me and mailed numerous photocopies. Several scholars assisted this study by offering their comments and by sharing various sources with me. Marion Lucas, professor of history at Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green, made me aware of resources at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and shared his note cards on the Reconstruction period with me. Dr. James Clotter, general editor of the Kentucky Historical Society and the leading scholar of the history of Kentucky, read the manuscript and made invaluable suggestions. Clotter also sent me numerous articles and references. My good friend from graduate school, Albert S. Broussard of the Department of History, Texas A&M University, also read the manuscript, making his helpful suggestions. Albert is the person I can always turn to for encouragement, reassuring me that what I am doing is significant. On several occasions, Kentucky scholars who heard me lecture on racial violence sent me information about a particular lynching or incident I would not have found on my own. I am extremely thankful to the scholars for sharing their research with me. In many different ways, the completion of this study has been assisted by Terry L. Birdwitzel, University, and archivist at the University of Kentucky. Every time I traveled to Lexington, Terry made available to me the many resources of the Division of Special Collections and Archives. Several times he rechecked newspapers and census data and mailed articles and other materials to me. Terry and I have traveled through Kentucky in researching this project. He too read the manuscript and made useful suggestions. Furthermore, while in Lexington, I could always count on being fed and entertained at Terry's home by his gracious wife, Janice, and their daughter, Jessica. My research project, which required spending considerable time in archives in Atlanta, Washington, and Kentucky, would have been impossible without financial support. Early on, I received a grant from the American Association for the Study of State and Local History, which financed several research trips. Grants from the University of Texas Research Institute, African and Afro-American Research Center, and Department of History's Dora Bonham Fund helped pay for travel and research materials. Oh, and that's Bonham. In addition, Betty Nunley, Nunley, administrative associate in the Afro-American Center, read the manuscript, pointing out any number of errors. Dorothy Motton, Motton, senior office assistant, counted the charts dozens of times, made numerous phone calls, and kept me organized. As I discovered several years ago when completing my first book, the people associated with Louisiana State University Press are great to work with. From the very first time I mentioned this proposed book to her, Beverly Jarrett, Jarrett, former associate director and executive editor, gave me encouragement. Also, Catherine Barton, Barton, former managing editor, is to be commended for suggesting numerous editorial changes that undoubtedly made this a better book. In dedicating this book to my parents and in-laws, I am making a public acknowledgement to 4 people who have aided me in more ways than they know. Finally, my family has made it easier for me to devote much of my time and energy to writing this book. Rebecca Ellison Wright, my daughter, has always helped my perspective on things, making me realize the importance of sometimes not working, but spending time with her. My spouse since our undergraduate days in college, Valerie Ellison Wright, has patiently listened to me talk about this study and has made any number of comments about the book. In addition to pursuing her own very demanding career, she somehow finds the time and the will to help me in all my endeavors. I will always be grateful to Valerie for what she has contributed to me. Oh, this here is just a map of Kentucky divided into 7 regions. If you can see that. It's just a map of Kentucky divided into 7 regions. We will have extra books eventually. Okay. Introduction. Kentucky violence, severe and long lasting. This study of racial violence in Kentucky is an outgrowth of my book on Louisville Blacks from 1865 to 1930. That study centered on the concept of polite racism, a form of oppression that extended a few concessions to African Americans as long as they accepted their place and remained at the bottom of society. Polite racism proved to be effective, for it tended to lull both African Americans and whites into believing that conditions in Louisville were not as bad as they were elsewhere. While doing the research on Louisville Blacks, I came across stories of lynchings that had occurred in the smaller towns in the state. I quickly realized that except for Louisville and Lexington, the state was similar to the Deep South in its attitude and its actions towards Afro-Americans. Furthermore, in Kentucky's larger cities, the police, an important symbol of white authority, were not above using force to ensure that blacks acted the way whites thought necessary. It became clear that racial violence, the reverse of polite racism, also existed in Kentucky and was probably more prevalent than the polite racism found in Louisville. Although poor, young, uneducated blacks were the primary victims of white violence, no black person within Kentucky was immune from attacks by whites. Furthermore, the entire legal system upheld white violence by refusing to apprehend, charge, and convict white offenders of blacks, thus ensuring that all Afro Americans, were at the mercy of whites. Racial violence in Kentucky would be evident in many forms: in the whipping of blacks by their former slave owners or by local police officials, in the destruction of black schools and property, and forcing all blacks in certain areas to leave the community, in the denial to blacks of right to fair trials, and in the cold-blooded murder of blacks, often at the hands of lynch mobs. A full understanding of the racial violence in Kentucky requires a look at the black experience immediately at the end of the Civil War. As Leon Litwack, Litwack, explains, the mere fact that blacks had been slaves, someone's property, had protected them from the worst abuses of hostile whites. With emancipation, however, Afro Americans had become vulnerable to attacks from whites. Another scholar of Southern history, Otis A. Singletary, Singletary, writes, when the definitive account of the South during Reconstruction is finally written, it will contain deep and depressing undertones of violence. Reconstruction was preeminently a period of violence. White Kentuckians responded to the social, political, and other changes with unheard of violence, even by Kentucky standards. With state officials refusing to aid blacks or to prevent outbreaks of violence, the federal government extended the Freedmen's Bureau to Kentucky in January 1866. Kentucky was the only slaveholding state that had remained loyal to the Union that also had the Bureau, which further aroused the hostilities of many embittered whites towards their former slaves. Violence made life extremely hazardous for agents of the Bureau. Moreover, this white violence became so widespread that many of the Northern Freedmen's Aid Societies that operated in other former slave states, helping the blacks in the transition from bondage to freedom, avoided Kentucky for fear of the lives of their workers. Okay, I get it now. The white violence in Kentucky during Reconstruction was most often directed at the white violence in Kentucky during Reconstruction was most often directed at and had its most devastating effect on the freedmen. Upon returning home from fighting in the Union Army, black soldiers were attacked by roaming white bands. As a report submitted to the Freedmen's Bureau explained, lawless men have recently seized several colored men who were former soldiers and abused them most brutally. The occasion of this is some meetings of the colored people in the Union League meetings. The Rebs have resolved to break them up and as a means have commenced a series of brutal whippings and beatings. On several occasions, groups of blacks petitioned the United States Congress for protection from white mobs, citing incidents of lynchings and other lawless acts. Violence was so spread in Mason County that a number of the freedmen refused to sign a petition, fearing that their churches and property would be destroyed as a result of their complaints. Although the Freedmen's Bureau failed to prevent most of the violence, blacks were rightfully concerned about the Bureau leaving the state. As an Owensboro black explained, the Bureau is our only protection in Kentucky. The civil laws of the state deprives us of our every right. Every black man is threatened in the state by every rebel. Upon the removal of the Bureau, he shall be paid up for daring to assert his manhood before that institution. Most often, blacks were limited in how they could respond to the violence of whites. Seeking protection in black communities, many rural former slaves began moving to Kentucky cities, especially Louisville and Lexington. Although their exact number is difficult to determine, many decided to quit the state altogether. Under the best of circumstances, the Bureau of Census tended to undercount the number of Afro Americans in the United States. Also, if a person moved into an area but stayed only a short period of time, he was probably not counted in the population for that area. Despite limitations in giving an accurate count to the number of blacks, the census data clearly showed that the percentage of blacks in Kentucky declined steadily over the decades. In 1860, blacks accounted for 20.4% of the total population. They reached their lowest point in 1950, when they constituted less than 7% of the population. From 1860 to 1900, the state's black population increased by only 48,539 from 2,063,167. Increased by only 48,539. It went from 263,167 to 284,706. While the white population more than doubled, reaching 1,862,309 by the start of the century. The first part of this study, recovering the Reconstruction period, will end with 1874. This period is especially significant because all aspects of racial violence in Kentucky, lynchings, legal lynchings, and mob rule were a part of black life by the mid-1870s. More than 1/3 of all lynchings that would take place in Kentucky occurred between the years 1865 and 1874. Lynchings, a brutal phenomenon that started during Reconstruction, would most surely continue in Kentucky in the years after 1875. Writing at the turn of the 20th century, James E. Cutler, Cutler, described lynching as a criminal practice which is peculiar to the United States. The practice whereby mobs capture individuals suspected of crime or take them from the officers of the law and execute them without any process at law, or break open jails and hang convicted criminals with impunity, is to be found in no other country of a high degree of civilization. A more recent scholar, James R. McGovern, explains that the key to the phenomenon is community approval, either explicit in the form of general participation by the local citizenry, or either explicit in the form of general participation by the local citizenry, or implicit in the form of acquittal of the killers without a trial. Scholars of lynching seem to agree that the total number of recorded lynchings falls short of the actual number. In Kentucky and elsewhere, several highly publicized lynchings, witnessed by thousands, occurred over the years. Yet a number of lynchings in rural areas were not, for whatever reasons, reported by the newspapers. The Chicago Tribune and New York Times, both excellent sources on lynchings between 1882 and 1918, failed to report several lynchings that occurred in Kentucky. Some lynchings probably still remain hidden from scholarly scrutiny because of source limitations. Folk traditions tell of people who were murdered in isolated counties and dumped into rivers and creeks, or who, according to biased white newspapers, escaped from the authorities and simply disappeared. In other words, this uniquely American phenomenon probably occurred to a degree far greater than what we can ever document. Most sources have indicated that at least 205 people were lynched in Kentucky. placing it ninth among states with the highest number of mob murders. By contrast, my findings revealed that at least 300 people were lynched By contrast, my findings revealed that at least 353 people were lynched in the Bluegrass State. A comparison of my figures for Kentucky with the number of lynchings for other states means, at least on the surface, that only 3 states had more lynchings than did Kentucky. This, of course, simply is not correct. It does suggest, however, that just as 205 lynchings for Kentucky is much too low a figure, the lynchings in Georgia, Mississippi, Texas, and elsewhere in the South have also been greatly undercounted. Further research in local newspapers and county histories, which proved to be invaluable sources in documenting 353 lynchings in Kentucky, should provide similar corrections for other states, especially in the number of lynchings that occurred prior to the mid-1880s. When discussing the lynching in their particular area, local newspapers gave all of the grisly details and significantly would often point out that lynching was not the first one that had happened in their area. When discussing a lynching in their particular area, local newspapers gave all of the grisly details and significantly would often point out that the lynching was not the first one that had happened in their area. In December 1896, after a black man was lynched in Mayfield, the local newspaper noted, "The hanging of Jim Stone is the first lynching for a similar crime that has occurred in the county since 1870. The hanging of Jim Stone is the first lynching for a similar crime that has occurred in the county since 1870, when 6 Negroes were hanged by mass mobs in and near the city. One was lynched in Bullock's Grove, one near the Primitive Baptist Church, one a short distance south of where Mr. William McDonald now lives, one at the old Connor Orchard, 2 at Kess Creek on the Paris Road, and one other in the same locality. This stopped the crime until the past few years, and Stone is the first one to suffer the penalty since 25 years ago." In March 1886, a black was lynched in Russellville for the attempted rape of a 12-year-old white girl. The Louisville Carrier-Journal, which documented lynchings that happened all over the state, explained in a matter-of-fact manner that Handy Woodward was hanged from a large sycamore tree, the same from which the notorious Sambo Bailey was swung into eternity at the hands of a mob about 2 years ago. Handy Woodward was hanged from a large sycamore tree, the same from which the notorious Sambo Bailey was swung into eternity at the hands of a mob about 2 years ago. When describing in 1889 the lynching of a black in Paris, the Courier Journal informed its readers that a Negro was hung here in 1867 in broad daylight in the courtyard for raping an 11-year-old daughter of Mr. Doolin, Doolin. In February 1902, Tom Brown died at the hands of a lynch mob in Jessamine County after being accused of rape. The local newspaper took the occasion to inform its readers that another black man had been lynched in the county for rape in August 1874. Thus, news of one lynching often led to a search in the earlier newspapers from that county or region for details about another lynching. Such details were vital to the documentation of lynchings in Kentucky prior to 1882. The Chicago Tribune started coverage of lynchings that year, showing how many people were killed and giving the reasons for those deaths. With the statistics of the Tribune in mind, a number of able scholars have speculated on why the lynchings of Afro Americans increased dramatically in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. In his brilliant study of race relations in the American South, Joel Williamson explains that by the 1880s, Southern whites were convinced that blacks had broken free from the restraining influence of whites that had dominated their lives during slavery. Furthermore, he noted that the Depression of the 1890s produced psychological effects on Southern white men of the Victorian era who saw themselves as the providers and protectors in their families. Let me read that again. In his brilliant study of race relations in the American South, Joel Williamson explains that by the 1880s, Southern whites was convinced that blacks had broken free from the restraining influences of whites that had dominated their lives during slavery. And that was just 20-something years, 1865 to 1880. But it, to me, seemingly, miraculously, black people built an empire almost overnight. With Black Wall Streets. Furthermore, he notes that the Depression of the 1890s produced psychological effects on Southern white men of the Victorian era, who saw themselves as the providers and protectors in their families. The rage of white men toward the black beast rapists, which of course was their own creation, was a kind of psychic compensation. Pursuing this point, Williamson states, if white men could not provide for their women materially, as they had done before, they could certainly protect them from a much more awful threat, the outrage of their purity, and hence their piety, P-I-E-T-Y, by black men. What white men might have lost on one side in affirming their sense of self, they might more than compensate for on the other. Bread for their women was important, but it was nothing alongside their purity. In an important study on crime and justice in the American South, Edward Ayers, A-Y-E-R-S, points out that whites had long associated blacks with sexuality. Therefore, he says, something else led to the increased violence of the 1880s. The lynching crisis, he concludes, was a byproduct of a new generation of Southern whites and blacks who had grown to adulthood without close, intimate contact of each other. He then adds, at the time the lynching crisis hit the South, no man under 30 years old, white or black, would have any memory of slavery at all. Only of racial distrust, conflict, and bloodshed, since most criminals and most violent men have always been young. It is safe to assume that most lynchers and lynching victims came from this new generation. These men feared each other with the fear of ignorance. They saw each other dimly, at a distance. However, the findings cited herein clearly show no sudden or dramatic increase in Kentucky's lynchings in the 1880s or 1890s. Indeed, the number of lynchings remained steady in the last 2 decades of the 19th century when compared with the decade immediately after slavery. At least 117 people were lynched, black people. At least 117 were lynched within the state between 1865 and 1874. In other words, 1/3 of the total number of lynchings in Kentucky happened in the decade after emancipation. In the period highlighted by Ayers, Williamson, and the other scholars, lynchings seemed more sensational, with many victims burned. to death and their bodies shamelessly mutilated. Many respectable whites, many respectable, many respectable whites condone the acts of the mob, speaking out bluntly on what steps should be taken to end the Negro problem in Southern society. These actions made a strong impression and, coupled with the yellow journalism of that day, contributed to the prominence given to lynchings in the newspapers. A modern-day parallel can be drawn with how the American public has become aware of family violence, especially child abuse. Much media attention has been given to the subject in the last decade. Dramatic court trials have made national news. Practically every community can point to its own awful example of a parent or a babysitter sexually abusing a child. Yet, as a recent book by Elizabeth Pleck shows, Pleck, family violence is not a recent phenomenon. During the years from 1874 to 1890, for example, in response to a number of highly publicized cases of assault on children, concerned reformers created organizations with the goal of ending family violence. It is highly possible, given the huge amount of publicity and the tough stance that law enforcement agencies have adopted in the 1980s, that the incidence of child abuse might actually be lower now than in the earlier period when these awful events were more than likely covered up. So too with lynchings. In short, my figures show that more lynchings occurred in the 15-year period from 1865 to 1880 than during any other 15-year period, even the years from 1885 to 1900, which most scholars and contemporary observers call the heyday of lynching. Prosperity. If scholars agree that it is extremely difficult to account fully for all of the lynchings that occurred in the period beginning in the 1880s, then it is almost impossible to have anything close to an accurate account of the number of Afro-Americans lynched from 1865 to 1880. Several newspaper stories from the early 1870s give details of raids in various parts of the state by the Ku Klux Klan or the regulators, during which, according to these accounts, more than 100 blacks were lynched. Since I could not obtain any corroborating evidence for these astonishing figures, they have been omitted from my account. Furthermore, in small communities, newspaper editors who denounced the lawless white bands for attacking Afro-Americans ran the risk of bodily harm. This led others to remain silent about lynchings. Many Kentucky whites, because they wanted the freedmen's bureau removed from the state, had yet another reason to cover up the number of blacks being lynched. The slave narratives must also be used with caution when attempting to document lynchings and other racial violence. A former slave, Richard Miller, informed an interviewer about the lynching in Danville of the wife of George Bland by the Ku Klux Klan during the Reconstruction years. According to Miller, the Klan members, after killing Bland's wife, forced him to view the body. He asked them to let him go back to the house to get something to wrap his wife in. Thinking he was sincere in his request, they allowed him to go. Instead of getting a wrapping for his wife, he got his Winchester rifle, shot and killed 14 of the Kluxers. The county was never bothered with the Klan again. However, George left immediately for the North. In all probability, this account is fictitious, especially the part about Bland killing 14 members of the Klan. Therefore, the lynching of his wife has not been included in my tabulation. If this study would encourage scholars of Georgia, Mississippi, Texas, and South Carolina, as well as the other states in which the number of lynchings greatly exceeded those in Kentucky, to investigate the period prior to the 1880s, then it will have achieved one of its purposes. Only then can we have a better understanding of the extent of this brutal form of oppression on Afro Americans. While the conclusions of Williamson, Ayers, and other scholars regarding the dramatic increase in lynchings in the late 1880s might be questioned, these scholars are correct when saying that the ultimate reason for the rise of the lynching bee was the same reason that has always led to white violence on black. Afro Americans were lynched for getting out of the place assigned them by white society. On more than one occasion, whites penned a note to the body of a lynch victim as a warning to other blacks that the same would happen to them unless they changed their ways, returned to work, quit agitating for their rights, in general left whites alone. Immediately after the Civil War, whites sought to maintain control over blacks through force. Not surprisingly, most of the blacks were lynched not for rape, but for being involved in politics. During the 1880s and 1890s, many white observers lamented the passing of the loyal Negroes that slavery had produced. In their place were new Negroes who, without the civilizing influence of whites, were actually regarded by whites as retrogressing on their barbaric African condition. In Louisville, Atlanta, New Orleans, and other southern cities, this attitude led to increased police brutality towards blacks. In the small towns and rural communities, it led to lynchings. The lynching and burning of one black became a vivid and violent reminder to all African Americans of the dire consequences of getting out of their place. The lynching and burning of one black became a vivid and violent reminder to all Afro Americans of the dire consequences of getting out of their place. As Williamson clearly explains, thus symbolically, the lynching was often seen as an act against the whole black community and not merely the execution of one or more criminals. Like lynching, mob rule was also an effective tool for the control of Afro Americans. However, unlike lynchings, which singled out individual blacks for summary punishment, riots directed violence toward all blacks, and especially their property. And remember, in Red Summer, it said that they really hated Cadillacs. For a black man to have a car, that was the utmost hatred for a black man to have a car. A car. Some cows. The most surprising aspect of my research on racial violence in Kentucky concerns the numerous instances of whites forcing blacks to leave their homes and land. Scholars have often failed to connect the practice of running blacks off their lands with lynching, but both were forms of oppression used by whites to keep blacks in their place. Furthermore, a thorough knowledge of this white camping activity in Kentucky shows, far more clearly than does lynching, that most of the violence blacks experienced resulted from economic activities, not from alleged attacks on white women. To justify the wholesale removal of Afro-Americans, whites often proclaimed that Afro-Americans were involved in criminal activities, especially stealing livestock. Yet, as white newspapers and local police records clearly show, whenever blacks were guilty of criminal offenses, even minor violations, they were dealt with quickly and severely by the law. In Kentucky, for a black to be merely suspected of an offense would have been grounds for immediate action to be taken against him. When whites decided to rid their era of Afro-Americans, therefore, it was not because of supposed criminal activities, but rather because of economic and social ones. In short, blacks who were prosperous or independent threatened the entire system of white supremacy. Yet, despite the lynchings and other acts of oppression, Kentucky blacks did not willingly submit to the whims of the white majority. They formed organizations, appealed to state officials, and on several occasions armed themselves to protect their property or prevent lynchings. Indeed, during the 1870s and again in the early 1900s, blacks challenged mobs by arming themselves and guarding the jailhouses to protect the lives of blacks accused of rape or murder. After a lynching in Georgetown in August in 1891, blacks resorted to arson to extract a measure of revenge, sending whites into a panic. Almost the same thing happened in Tiptonville, in Tennessee. Ike Fitzgerald was hung, and the whole main street was set on fire. And although it could never be proved, I think it was like 30 buildings was burned. And although it could never be proved what happened to Main Street burning, they suspect it was the black people, the black community that set Main Street on fire and burnt all the buildings up. All over this country, I don't believe there's a footprint of land that ain't been soaked in blood. I do not. When whites decided to rid their area, yet despite the lynchings and other acts of oppression, Kentucky blacks did not willingly submit to the whims of the white majority. They formed organizations, appealed to state officials, and on several occasions armed themselves to protect their property or prevent lynchings. Indeed, during the 1870s and again in the early 1900s, blacks challenged mobs by arming themselves and guarding the jailhouses to protect the lives of blacks accused of rape or murder. After a lynching in Georgetown in August 1891, blacks resorted to arson to extract a measure of revenge, sending whites into a panic. On several occasions after a lynching, whites grew so concerned about blacks arming themselves that curfews were instituted and the militia called out. Obviously, Kentucky blacks were far more passive or impotent. Although not always successful, they nevertheless consistently adopted measures to defend themselves. Kentucky always had a handful of whites committed to ending racial violence. The state's first Republican governor, William O. Bradley, was influential in Kentucky passing its first comprehensive anti-lynching law. He constantly berated county officials for allowing lynchings to occur and for refusing to prosecute members of lynch mobs. Bradley even offered rewards for information, leading to the arrest and indictments of members of lynch mobs. Two other Republican governors also attempted to end mob rule within the state. Elected to office in 1907, Augustus E. Wilson, Willson, sent the state militia to western Kentucky in an attempt to end the violent reign of the Night Riders. During the early 1920s, Edwin Morrow, Morrow, spoke out against the continuation of lynch law and was responsible for the passage of another anti-lynching law. Governor Morrow became very active with the Commission on Interracial Cooperation, a group that worked to end racial unrest in the South. As governor, he urged white Christians on a specially designated interracial Sunday to discuss the religious, moral, physical, and educational needs of the state's black citizens. The efforts of Afro-Americans concerned state officials and organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People led to a drastic decline in the number of lynchings in the state by 1930. This was, of course, consistent with the national trend. Another factor, however, also accounts for the decline in the number of lynchings within the state. Whites manipulated the legal system, ensuring that the vast majority of blacks accused of rape or murder received the death penalty, the same punishment meted out by the lynch mob. Death. In his book on lynchings, Arthur Raper, R-A-P-E-R, touches on the subject of legal lynchings. In the efforts to prevent a lynching or to prevent further mob outbreaks after a lynching, peace officers and leading citizens often make promises which virtually preclude impartial court procedure, which virtually preclude impartial court procedure. It is not incorrect to call a death sentence secured under such circumstances as legal lynching, except in rare cases. The presence of a mob defeats the end of impartial justice, either by lynching the accused person or by forcing the courts to summary and perhaps unjust convictions. On several occasions, white authorities and community leaders pleaded with the mob to allow the law to take its course, and in cases wherein a black was accused of rape or murder, justice was swift, sure, and painful. From the end of the Civil War into the 1940s, if indeed not later, countless numbers of black men were tried in hostile environments, with judges and juries convinced of their guilt before hearing any evidence. Some of these cases took less than an hour from start to finish, with the jury not even leaving the courtroom to deliberate on the fate of the defendant. It is not difficult to imagine what would have happened to the members of the jury if they had returned a verdict of not guilty or had called for leniency. The matter of such legal lynchings is often one of definition and is extremely difficult to prove because such activities were carried out by the book and had the sanction of the law behind them. Perhaps more astonishing than the law discriminating against Afro-Americans are the many statements by whites denouncing the law for not adequately punishing criminals. Editorials in newspapers all over the state, even in the highly respected Courier Journal, reached the conclusion in the late 1800s that the courts were too soft on crime and therefore constituted to the lawlessness of criminals. The lynchings performed by well-meaning whites, these editorials concluded, were necessary to protect the rights of law-abiding citizens. Obviously, the writers assumed that because much of the lawlessness in the state, particularly in eastern Kentucky, went unpunished, the law must have been lenient towards blacks as well. But as Frederick Douglass explained when commenting on blacks and the law, I'm hungry. Whatever may be said of their weakness when required to hold a white man or a rich man, the meshes of the law are certainly always strong enough to hold and punish a poor man or a Negro. In this case, there is neither color to blind, money to corrupt, nor powerful friends to influence court or jury against the claims of justice. All the presumptions of law and society are against the Negro. In the days of slavery, he was presumed to be a slave, even if free, and his word was never taken against that of a white man. To be accused was to be condemned, and the same spirit prevails today. Nearly all scholars acknowledge that only rarely, if indeed ever, did Afro-Americans receive anything approaching fair trials in the South. Yet few have closely investigated this phenomenon. This study of Kentucky indicates how legal lynchings, in conjunction with lynchings and mob rule, operated to ensure that Afro-Americans knew their place and remained at the bottom of society. As Jimmy Franklin notes in his study on Oklahoma blacks, one cannot escape or ignore the relationship between mob violence and the existing political system that maintained and reinforced the social order of the times. Richard Hofstadter, Hofstadter, perhaps more than any other scholar, suggested the extent to which racial violence exists in our nation. His essay, Reflections on Violence in the United States, points out that violence, especially racial, and ethnic violence, has always been part of American culture. What is most exceptional about the Americans is not the voluminous record of their violence, but their extraordinary ability in the face of that record to persuade themselves that they are among the best behaved and best regulated of people. Hofstadter makes the point that lynchings, open public murders conceived and carried out more or less spontaneously by a mob, are a distinctively American institution. The primary function of lynchings, Hofstadter strongly argues, was to make sure that Afro-Americans understood their place. The lynching of blacks, although apparently spontaneous, seemed also to manifest a desire to establish beyond any doubt the point that the caste system of the South could not be challenged. In this respect, there is a suggestive psychological similarity, even if no easily established historical affiliation between the psychology of lynchings and the pattern of suppression of slave revolts. By and large, slaves under the American slave system were deemed entitled to a trial, but where rebellions, real or imagined, were concerned, the law was swift and the punishment was often harsh or even barbarous. From the beginning, whites seemed to be determined through the brutality of reprisals to impress upon slaves the futility and the extraordinary danger of rebelling or otherwise resisting slavery. In Kentucky, even in spite of the harsh reprisals awaiting their attempts to improve their situation in life, some blacks, to be sure, always small in numbers, challenged the status quo. Indeed, the story of George Denning, Dinning, is revealing, if for no other reason than that he was an exception to what generally happened to Kentucky blacks. Denning, born a slave, illiterate his entire life, the father of 12 children, somehow saved enough money to purchase a farm. Indeed, by the time he was 40, Denning had accumulated enough land and animals to arouse the envy of his white neighbors. Oh, see? Around 11 o'clock on the evening of January the 27th, 1897, 25 heavily armed white men knocked on Denning's door and issued a warning, telling him that he had 10 days to leave Simpson County. Their rationale was that Denning had stolen chickens and hogs. Denning denied being a thief, saying that the leading white citizen of the area could vouch for his good character. Members of the mob, who were already prepared for trouble, became indignant over Denning's comments and started shooting into the house, wounding the black farmer twice. He somehow reached his gun and fired into the crowd, killing Jody Conn, Conn. The men then fled the scene. Fearing their return, Denning left his home. The next morning, he turned himself into the authorities in Franklin, the largest city in Sampson County. After learning that Denning was in police custody, the mob went back to his farm, drove off his family, even though it was a bitterly cold winter day, and one of the children was gravely ill, took what possessions they wanted, and burned his house to the ground. Concerned for Denning's life, the sheriff of Franklin had him removed to Bowling Green and eventually to Louisville for safekeeping. Determined that Denning would not be lynched, Governor Bradley sent a squad of state troopers to protect Denning during the trial in Simpson County. The reporter for the New York Times, like many observers, speculated that even though Denning was a black man on trial for the murder of a white man, his case would be one rare instance where a black man would be found innocent. The interesting feature of the case is that Denning, on the face of the facts, cannot be convicted as he was defending himself. No witnesses can appear against him without admitting that they were members of the Ku Klux Klan. Nevertheless, given the nature of lynch law in Kentucky, Denning was found guilty of manslaughter on the testimony of the mob members who had been with Kahn. The jury apparently ignored the fact that Denning was on his own property and had been wounded by someone from the mob. He was sentenced to 7 years of hard labor. Then they turned around and made it a law. If you commit a crime with someone and someone is hurt or killed, then you will be charged for that crime. You will be charged for that death of that person. The day after the trial, the governor's office began receiving letters calling for a full and complete pardon for Denning. Many of the letters, not surprisingly, came from Black churches, organizations, and political clubs, but an even greater number of letters came from whites, a few of whom identified themselves as former Confederates. Nearly all the whites expressed a strong belief in the law of self-defense, the right of a man, even a Black man, to defend his home from invaders. Attorney Augustus E. Wilson, who would serve as governor in the early 1900s, urged Bradley to free Denning immediately. Wilson concluded that Denning's action made him a hero, one man who had stood up to a lawless mob. On July the 17th, after Denning had been in prison for 10 days, Governor Bradley made known his decision concerning a pardon. A reading of the transcript of the trial, he declared, proved that the 25 white men were not on a peaceful mission, as some of them had testified in court. Members of the mob had fired first, the governor pointed out. It was a shame that no indictments had been made against any of them for attacking Denning and his family, and for returning the next day and destroying his home. In perhaps the key passage in his statement, Bailey said, in protecting himself, he did no more than any other man would or should have done under the same circumstance. And instead of being forced to wear a convict's garb, he is entitled not only to acquittal, but to the admiration of every citizen who loves good judgment, who loves good government, and desires the perpetuation of free institutions. The governor announced Denning released from prison immediately. Upon being freed, Denning moved to Indiana, for he realized that law officers in Simpson County would make no attempt to protect him and his family from the mob. For most Kentucky Blacks, not being lynched or enduring a prison term would have been all that they could have hoped for after such an ordeal. Denning, however, wanted justice. He hired Bennett H. Young, a former Confederate officer and one of Kentucky's most respected attorneys, to file suit in federal court against the men who had attacked him. Because they had testified at Denning's trial, their identities were known. Fortunately for Denning, his case was held in Louisville. After hearing the testimony, the judge instructed the jury to find in favor of Denning. Going further, the judge remarked that the case was such that punitive damages could be imposed. The all-white jury heeded the judge's words, returning with a verdict of $50,000 in Denning's favor against 6 of the 12 members of the mob. They even attached the estate of the deceased Jody Kahn to help settle the suit. As a reporter for the Courier-Journal explained, verdict is a vindication for Denning, even though he will probably not collect $1, since most of them own nothing, or at best, a homestead. Realizing the overwhelming odds against them, most Blacks did not stand up to the mob. Those who simply left the state, or who anguished and stayed, Their untold and often unknown stories are a further element of tragedy for those who bore the burden of being Black in America at that time. Yet, as the study shows, while Black Kentuckians faced an intransigent, intransigent form of racism that was irrational and unbending, they often were neither passive nor cowardly. That few changes occurred is not a reflection of a lack of effort by them or their few white allies, but is a strong indictment of the racism that existed in Kentucky, the South, and America during that time. This book simply portrays the hardships Afro-Americans encountered in Kentucky and their efforts to end racial oppression. It is not a pleasant story, but it is one that must be told. And you can help tell it.